Hey, everybody. Welcome to Roots and Branches. I'm Cullen. I'm the pastor here. It is my distinct privilege to be a part of this community and all that it's doing as we sink our roots deep in faith and stretch out our branches in love for God's world. And that's why we're here. We are here, when Jesus says, love your neighbor, we're taking him seriously. And we also take note of the fact he doesn't put any exceptions on that list. He doesn't say love your neighbor who looks like you or talks like you. He doesn't say love your neighbor from the same country as you or from the same economic background as you. Love your neighbor who loves others the same way that you do. None of that is built into that. It's love your neighbor as yourself. No exceptions, no restrictions. And we are here to offer that same wide open love to our neighborhood. So thank you for being here and being part of the ways that God is exploding with love in this community and in this world. Again, I just want to mention at the close of my message here, we're going to have offering and communion. There's a drop box. If you have a check or cash, you can put in the back of the room, as well as a place you can scan a card. And then you'll be invited to offer communion to one another, to actually celebrate the community that's gathered here. And there are stations with communion on the left, on the right, and in the back. And then there's also a station down here. So if you'd like to be served communion quietly, meditatively, a little more traditionally, I can serve you right up here. Otherwise, I encourage you to go and meet with one another and serve one another and to feast on God's love that's available to all. Just so you know, you don't have to be a member of this church or any church to take communion with us. All you have to do is want to take one step closer to God, whatever that means to you. So you're all welcome to these tables that are not actually tables. They're actually stools, but that's beside the point. It's just more efficient in terms of footprint, right? Anyway, I want to let you know that today is part 2 of a series that we're calling The Belly of the Beast. And we've been looking at Jonah chapter by chapter, and maybe you even read chapter 2 in advance. I told you it was a short one, right? And you can read chapter 3 in advance of next week. But we've been talking about kind of the dark side of Jonah and what Jonah teaches us about when we are in the depths of our own life. Next week, we're going to move on to chapter 3. That's the day where Jonah goes out and converts an entire pagan city. Wow. Good job. But actually, next week, Jenny's going to be out of town. So next week, I'm going to be leading the band. I'm looking forward to that. And Patrick is going to be sharing the message, our very own, our resident prophet. So everyone's like, yep, we know. When Patrick brings the word, he straight brings it. So, so please come and join us on next Sunday for that. It'll be fantastic. Today, we are in Jonah 2, where Jonah is in the belly of the beast. But I want to start by telling you a story that I recently heard about a young man whose life was falling apart. After finishing college with a religion major, he found himself adrift. He was working at a sandwich shop to make ends meet when he came down with mono. Nobody needs that. And that spilled over into a liver infection. And all that time spent convalescing from illness led him to get kicked out of the band that he was in with friends since high school. And he had just broken up with his girlfriend too. So, I mean, just the pits, right? All these different things. Life was not working the way he'd planned. I think we all find ourselves at that point one time or another. So what do you do when you're in that situation, when you're at the end of your rope, when you're in the belly of the beast? Well, if you're this guy, you grab your guitar and your recording equipment and you head to your dad's hunting shack in rural Wisconsin to just see what happens. And that young man was named Justin Vernon. And that hunting shack was the birthplace of the band Bon Iver, and it was the place where the platinum-selling album For Emma Forever Ago was written, start to finish. There's something about that story that actually isn't surprising at all. Because we know instinctively that great art often comes out of a place of great suffering. And it's in those dark places that creative people can tap into something that they couldn't find before. Hardship can be that place that gives birth to something beautiful. But that's not how we feel about the hard times when we're in the middle of them, is it? Take Jonah, for example. Last week we talked about how his choice to run from God's call landed him in the belly of this great fish. And today we're in chapter 2. And this is Jonah's prayer from that dark place. And this prayer comes out in the form of a song, as poetry. And again, this is art that emerges from a dark place. Literally a dark place. There ain't no daylight in the belly of a fish. And here's how Jonah starts his prayer from the belly of the beast. I called out to the Lord in my distress, and he answered me. From the belly of the underworld, I cried out for help. You have heard my voice. You had cast me into the depths in the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounds me. All your strong waves and rushing water passed over me. Now, I'm going to stop for a second here, because if we think about the events that just transpired, Jonah's prayer is not actually an accurate recounting of the story that we just heard in chapter 1. Jonah says to God, you cast me in the depths. But technically, it's those other dudes on the boat that cast him into the depths. And when they found out that the storm that they were in would sink them all, and it was this prophet's fault because he was disobeying his God, they picked him up and flung him into the water. And upon so doing, the storm has died down, and this great fish came and swallows Jonah. Right, we know this part of the story. So no, God didn't sink Jonah. But if you've been in a place like this, a place of darkness, depression, loss in your own life, then you know that this is the place mentally where we automatically go. No matter how our choices or other circumstances have led to this predicament we find ourselves in, we lay all the blame on God. Right? How could you do this to me? What did I do to deserve this? Does that sound familiar? And I'm just going to let you in on some helpful information. God can handle it. God is not scared off. God does not stop loving you for a second when you yell your anger at God. So feel all the feels is what I'm saying. And it's okay to even direct your frustration at God because God can take it, whether or not it's actually true that it's God's fault. God is big enough and graceful enough to take that undeserved blame and hold it for you when you don't have another place that you can put it. Like if you've ever, as a parent, had to scold or discipline a child and they say, you're ruining my life. Maybe you've heard this one, right? Like that's the exact same tone of voice that God hears, all right, when we're shouting at God. You're ruining my life. God's like, you're going to be fine, is what God says. The harder part of all of this is not like what's happening theologically and if God is still loving us. That's not in question. God's love is a constant. The hard part is the despair that we put ourselves in. And you can hear that in Jonah's prayer as it goes on. He says in verses 4 and 5, so I said, I have been driven away from your sight. Will I ever look on your holy temple again? Waters have grasped me to the point of death. The deep surrounds me. And when we find ourselves in this dark place, it can sometimes feel like it will last forever. Jonah says, will I ever see the temple again? He thinks this is the end, which is a reasonable assumption when you're being slowly digested by a giant fish. He's on the brink between life and death, surrounded by the deep. And he can't see the way out. In fact, he can't see anything because, as I may have mentioned, it's dark in there. When you're struggling with the real heavy stuff of life, when your mental health isn't where it could be, this is how it actually feels. like there are no options, like it will always be this way. So how is it that these circumstances that can put us in a place of such hopelessness be the same circumstances that produce such creativity from some people? How do some people take crappy circumstances and turn them into the fertilizer from which something new can grow? So we're going to hop back to this song from Jonah and see if it leads us anywhere helpful. And it does. That's why I'm talking about it. When my endurance was weakening, Jonah says, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you, to your holy temple. Those deceived by worthless things lose their chance for mercy, but me, I will offer a sacrifice to you with a voice of thanks. Jonah starts off here with, when my endurance was weakening. And I learned something new this week that I'm going to share with you. So the Hebrew word that is translated here as endurance is actually the same word that's translated a few verses earlier as the word death, and it's the same word from the chapter before that is translated as life. Hebrew's a crazy language, folks. So it's this really fluid word that is showing us that the boundary between life and death is razor thin. And it's showing us that Jonah is at this place where that is truer than ever. And what does he do? What does Jonah do when he's in that thin place between life and death? Jonah says, I remembered the Lord. And a little later, he says, I will offer a sacrifice to you with a voice of thanks. So the trick for surviving those hard times isn't to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It isn't to push down those feelings and gut it out and power through. You aren't going to make it through the belly of the beast with better behavior or better religion. The way you survive and even grow because of your time in the dark place is to allow it to break you. To break the old you, the version of you that came into that hardship. Well, that hardship might just push you to the point that you can no longer step into the rest of your life the same. But when you allow it to break the old you, then you can become the person that these changes are giving birth to. Jonah says that this feels like sacrifice. And it is a sacrifice. It's hard work to let go of the person you were before tragedy struck, before the loss, before things went sideways. But it's in the act of letting go of who we think we should be that we discover who God is creating us to be. And isn't that always going to be a better option? To let go of who we think we should be so that God can create us who we are best going to be in God's image. And maybe that's what Jesus is getting at when Jesus said, all who want to come after me must say no to themselves, take up their crosses daily, and follow me. All who want to save their lives will lose them, but all who lose their lives because of me will save them. Like, this is just a real trippy turn of phrase, right? It doesn't quite hold together. Like, if I want to save my life, I should, look out for myself, right? Isn't that how we understand it in our culture? But I think part of what Jesus is getting at the very least, is that those times of sorrow and hardship make us into who we become. They develop character and beauty within us, but only if we take our focus off of our problems and set it on the God who loves us and sustains us through it all. I am going to take a moment and let you know that God works in some pretty interesting ways. This was a complicated Sunday morning for me on this day when I'm talking about being in a difficult place. I forgot my sermon and my cell phone at home. And when I was going to try and print off a new copy, the power went out in the room with the printer. We figured it out, Laurel. No harm, no foul. There were other things also. And so I was running around frantically this morning, trying to fix it, right? Like trying to do better so that everything would go all right. Like, maybe I should have listened to the guy who wrote this sermon because he had some tips for me about this. That it's okay when things aren't going well. When things aren't going as planned, it's actually the opportunity to be present to those issues and to allow them to form you into who God is creating you to be. And so we're going to do something together this morning, okay? Just a little meditative practice, all right? So I want you to close your eyes with me, all right? And we're going to reflect together for just a little bit. This is something we don't often take time to do in our everyday lives. I'm encouraging you to join in this with me right now. I want you to think about a time when you were in the belly of the beast, when you were swallowed by darkness. Now, maybe you're on the other side of it right now, and maybe you're right in that moment, right at this time, on this day. And if you're on the other side of that predicament, make a mental list about the ways that you've grown into the person you are because of that experience. How the darkness made me who I am. How you've grown in character, in strength. Or maybe you're in that darkness right now. You're stressed. You're grieving. Things haven't gone the way you planned. I'm not going to tell you that everything's going to be all right. I'm not going to tell you that God has a plan. Those words don't really help. All they do is delegitimize your feelings. And Jonah shows us it's okay to feel those feelings and even to point them at God. So if you're in the depths, right there with Jonah today, reflect on this. If Jesus were standing here in front of you, looking you in the eye, what would you want to hear Jesus say to you about what you're going through? What would those words of hope and a future sound like? Whatever you're going through, whatever you've been through, Jesus' love is steadfast. You are deeply loved and worthy of love. You are God's love made flesh for the sake of this world. May you hold that deep truth, knowing that God can work through these circumstances and that God is present in the midst of them. You can come back to me now. Whatever you were imagining, whatever you were holding in your heart and in your mind, whatever place you're at, whether you're in the depths or simply remembering them, know that any place you find yourself is a place that you can find God. Any circumstance can be the right circumstance to grow you into the person God created you to be. Every day comes with a fresh invitation to die, to break, to stop being the old you and to come alive in a new way that you've never imagined. And the hardships you're facing are a reminder of that invitation that stands before us. Amen.